So after the book has all been bound, everything has been sewn onto the edges, you'll notice that the ends of the paper stick way out. And so the next step is to trim all of these. The historic method that's most documented is using a draw knife. I did some experiments. This is a fairly small draw knife, and they would have used probably a much larger draw knife for this kind of job. But I did some experiments using the hand plane, and actually found that the hand plane gave a really nice edge on the parchment as I was going. And so I did this for all three sides, going from draw knife to do the bulk of the trimming all the way down, and then alternating to a hand plane to help clean up the edge just a little bit smoother. This specific style, everything's trimmed after the boards are sewn on, and so everything's just trimmed flush with the boards, which makes things a little bit easier with the hand plane. You'll notice that I'm having to hold the hand plane at kind of an angle, and this allows it to cut a little bit better through the tough parchment, which is way harder to plane than wood is. So the next step is actually to take some linen. Historically, using old leftover blue linen was fairly common, so I found some old leftover blue linen and pasted it up, and then put the book on it. What this does is this reinforces the spine and secures the spine, but also creates a barrier between the leather and the pages of the spine themselves. And so I centered it up and lay it down one direction, and then turn it to the other direction. I thought about lifting the linen itself, and that was a terrible plan. And settle them both in, and press everything down, and then once it's done, I trimmed up the linen to make it even and give a nice transition once I actually put the leather on, because any amount of height that you see, you're actually going to see it come through the leather once you paste the leather on. And so I cut it and peeled it. I actually ended up doing another cut on it later that I eliminated, but I cut both sides. And then I laid paste on the top to help smooth out the transition, as well as make it stronger and a little bit stiffer, and kind of adhere it better to the board by putting adhesive all the way through. So let it dry. And then it was time to do the end bands. So the headband and the tailband of this specific style of late Coptic binding, there's two cords that run across the top of the spine and the top of and the bottom of the spine. And there is a stitching technique that goes through the holes in the page and then loops up and around and does kind of a figure 8 around those two cords and then comes back down. Does the same thing into each of the gatherings, and then when that's done, drill a hole or carve a channel and poke the cords down into that. Sometimes the leather is just molded over those, but I like the idea of securing those ends into the book boards themselves. So did this on the head and the tail on both sides, and used my awl to tuck them into those holes, which was more problematic than I expected it to be. At this point, I had to actually carve the channels for the closure. And so the closure on this is actually a tucked strap that goes into a channel in the back cover. So I'm carving out that channel, and it actually goes all the way through and has a wedge that holds it in place. And so I used my mallet and chisel to carve that channel, and then kind of hand cleaned that whole channel up and evened everything out and planed it down. So then I have to take the strap, which is a slit braided strap on brass with brass hardware that I made, and trim it to width and make sure everything fits in really well. And then I tuck the strap through and get everything laid the way I want it to lay. And then the next step is actually to cut that wedge, and then carved it down just a little bit so that it fits a little bit easier, and then wedge that in I realized that it wedged just way easier from the front, although I like the idea of wedging it from the back better. And then trim both ends off. And the next step now is to prep the leather. And so I cut a piece of leather just a little bit larger than I was going to need it. And then marked out where the book would lay on that leather. So actually I didn't carve it much bigger than I needed. Sometimes I do. The next step was to actually measure the thickness of the board and then account for that board thickness when I'm cutting my corners so that everything will lay even and will curve around that. It's a little bit harder because the corners aren't square, and since they're not square and they're rounded, you have to kind of give a little bit more in some areas and a little bit less in other areas. Thankfully, once the leather is wet, you can adjust that and stretch things a little bit. So then I slit where the head and tail are going to be. Then I'm checking to make sure it all is kind of in the right spot and fits the way I want it to fit. There's a lot of this adjusting and just kind of finicking and looking and seeing if it all fits the way it's supposed to fit and things are adjusted correctly, that I don't really put in most of it. So then the next step is specifically in the head and tail to actually chamfer and actually trim that leather down so that it is a nice even transition there. And then I chamfered all the way around the leather. So this wasn't always done historically at this time period. Frequently it was actually done after the book was bound, and then they would chamfer from what's effectively the grain side on the inside of those book covers, or not at all. This one I just really thought just a little bit of chamfer will make those transitions a little bit easier in the paste down, but historically wasn't necessarily necessary or even done very often. And then paste down the strap and then wet out the grain side of the leather, the outside of the leather. I did a little bit of staining on this with walnut, and then I'm pasting, so it's a wheat paste, a wheat starch paste. The paste on the inside, close it up, and let that soak in. Let it dry, and then wet out the outside of the leather again, open it up, and then scrape out the wheat paste and clean all of that dried wheat paste off, because it all kind of soaks in and dries out into the leather. And then we do that another time where I paste everything out, close it up, let it dry, and then come back to it about half an hour later, wet out the outside of the leather again, 15 minutes to an hour, open it back up again, and then scrape out the dried out paste again. So what this is doing is this is keeping this from happening when I go to paste up the book, and so we're absorbing all of the paste into those pores, the liquid, the starch, all of it goes in, and then I paste it up again. So add another layer of paste, and then I'm gluing down the head and tail parts, and there's the tail. And sadly, I missed actually recording putting the book into this, but I pasted it and laid it down and flattened it, put it in the press, and then opened it up, turned in, did all of the turn-ins and the adjustments on that, and then pulled it out of the press once everything's pressed up with blotting paper on either side. And then there it is, mostly finished. What I have to do here is I have to drill a hole for the pin to secure the strap to. There it is. And so this is the back after tooling. This is what those Endbands look like. And this is the front after tooling, and it's all done.